After a very intense 4 to 5 minute dogfight, and after firing 5 missiles at him between myself and my wingman, I was finally able to get a radar lock on at minimum range, about 4,000 feet out. Fired a radar-guided Sparrow missile, and it tracked on it, guided via the radar beam. The airplane snap rolled, and first snap roll around, out popped a parachute. And it was the MiG pilot in his parachute. And I had to aggressively maneuver my airplane to the side to keep from flying right through his parachute. Now, this is kind of humorous, but the first thing, strangely, that went through my mind after I flew by the MiG pilot in his parachute was, I want to be sure I get that kill confirmed. Because I'd read all these stories about World War II and Korea, fighter pilots that didn't get credit for a victory because nobody else saw it, nobody could confirm it. And in the F-4D that I was flying, we didn't have a gun in the airplane, so there was no gun camera. And then the next thought that goes through your mind is, you're way away from home, you have no air refueling support, and we're very low on fuel because we had been in this 4 to 5 minute dogfight. I mean, it was a scary kind of a time. The thing that I think about most when I think about my early childhood days, I grew up really in the middle of World War II. And so literally every male role model I had was wearing a uniform. And somehow I became attracted to those beautiful silver pilot wings. And then, of course, my dad's influence too. Wherever we lived around the country, we were close to an airport. And these beautiful airplanes were flying over our house all the time. Most of these were World War II vintage fighter planes, and also the Korean War vintage fighter planes. And so somewhere down deep in my heart, I guess I'd always wondered if I had what it takes to be a fighter pilot. Never realizing that I would have that opportunity, but that was what got me going in that direction at the beginning. Well, the main thing was we were trying to protect the United States against any kind of a bomber attack from the Soviet Union. And so at that time we had these RC-121s based on both the East Coast and the West Coast. And we were flying picket lines up and down each coast, 24/7. And then when the Cuban Missile Crisis erupted in the early 60s, they established a detachment in Orlando at McCoy Air Force Base. And we started doing the same thing between Key West and Cuba. And so that's what that wing did, that's what its mission was. And basically we had the capability to not only detect any kind of incoming enemy airplanes, but also to control fighters on intercepts of those incoming airplanes, should that materialize. But my navigator experience was kind of funny too. I was in deep trouble when I first started college. My mom and dad sent me to college, and I'd finished my first year, did okay, and I'm into my second year, and the social life sort of took priority over other things, such as my studies, and so they basically laid the law down to me that, we're not sending you to school with grades like that. And in those days, if you didn't have a college deferment, you were going to be drafted. So in an act of desperation, I went down to the Air Force recruiter, and at the time they had an aviation cadet program. And I signed up for that, and if you were physically qualified and could pass the mental test, then you had the opportunity to come on active duty as an aviation cadet. And after a year of intense military and flying training, you received your commission as a second lieutenant and your wings. And I'll never forget when I tested for that, because I thought I had flunked the test. It was just a very difficult test. And I had no idea what I was going to do with the rest of my life at that point. But fortunately for me, I did pass the test, and I was able to come in the Air Force that way. And started off as a navigator, and then went to pilot training about 2.5 years later. It was very difficult for us to maintain our gunnery qualifications in Europe, just because of the low ceilings that are prevalent there most of the year. And so what we would do periodically, usually about twice a year, the squadron would deploy down to Libya, to Wheelus Air Base in Libya. And there was a gunnery range there, and we would do all of our weapons qualifications down there, nuclear qualifications and conventional, and get all that done down there. And that was excellent flying. I mean, we really got to perform the airplane to the maximum. There was no restriction down there against flying supersonic. So it was a lot of fun flying down in Libya. I found myself, as I've already described, in a squadron that I dearly loved, and I loved the guys I was flying with, and I owed them a lot because they taught me so much. And so, because I had only been in the squadron and in Europe for 1.5 years, I was given the opportunity to either volunteer and go to Southeast Asia flying the F-105, or stay there at Spangdahlem Air Base and check out in the F-4 Phantom. The organization was transitioning over to the F-4, and all the 105s were going to go to Southeast Asia. And I made the somewhat difficult choice, but it seemed to come easy to me at the time, of staying with the 105 and staying with my friends and the guys I loved to fly with, and going to war. And so I volunteered, and in January 1967, I found myself at Korat Air Base in Thailand flying combat missions. In those days, too, your combat tour was over after you flew 100 missions over North Vietnam. And that was typically taking about 8 months, sometimes even a little bit less. So your combat tour was either going to be when you finished 100 missions over North Vietnam, or 1 year, whichever came first. So I started flying in January 1967, and by August I had finished my 100 missions over the North and came home. And leading up to the first combat mission is kind of an emotional thing as well. As when I left Europe, heading to the Pacific, the first place you stop is Clark Air Base in the Philippines, where they have jungle survival school. Clark Air Base is a large Air Force base, and it ended up being almost like an R&R base for those pilots who were flying combat missions. Every now and then they would get some time off and they'd come to Clark and relax and take it easy and, you know, and just generally have a good time. And so as I arrived at Clark to attend jungle survival school, in the officers club you're socializing with your friends who have already had some combat missions under their belt. Well, they have no mercy on you. I mean, everything is embellished, everything is magnified, everything is horrible. I mean, there's no way, you know, in the 105 community, we had a saying is, there ain't no way. And it was sort of a tongue-in-cheek thing about how difficult it was to get to your 100 mission point and survive that so that you could go home. But fighter pilot humor is sort of like that, you know, no mercy at all. But as a professional military pilot, particularly a fighter pilot, before you've tasted combat, you always wonder, do I have what it takes to measure up? Can I perform in that pressure-packed environment? Some people can, some people can't. And I was amazed that there were a few of my squadron mates who were some of the best peacetime pilots you ever saw. They could knock the eyes out of a bombing competition, they could do all this. But the pressure of combat was more than they could handle, and they became just really not very good. And so, fortunately for me, somehow I was able to compartmentalize those things and function in spite of the pressures of combat. But that's something that runs through your mind. You want to be sure, you think that you can do it, but until you really taste it, you don't know. And everybody is afraid when you go into heavy combat. Everybody is afraid. It's like the butterflies you get before an athletic competition, but worse, because the consequences are greater. And so but you just never, you're always curious about yourself, and are you going to be able to measure up to that standard that you hope you can? And you don't know until you see the first bullets fly. And like I said, fortunately for me, in spite of the fear, I was able to function. And as a result, finished my combat tour successfully. I don't remember anything difficult or unusual about it, other than it was the first one. And typically what would happen is there were different grades of difficulty of combat missions that were assigned to our unit. Some were just two-ship flights with a forward air controller somewhere in Laos, for instance, or over the southern part of North Vietnam. These areas are relatively lightly defended, nothing like the Hanoi area. And so in order to get what we called a counter, a mission logged that really counted toward your 100 mission goal, it had to be flown over North Vietnam itself. And but there are differing degrees of difficulty, and so when you were a brand new pilot, you would be assigned one of those, an easier mission. And then after about 10 missions, then you would be thrown right in there with the most difficult ones. And again, as a new pilot, you're going to start off as a wingman, and then you work your way up to element lead, and eventually, if you're performing well, you can be a flight lead, and then maybe, a mission lead. our typical missions were 16 F-105s going on a single target. So that's 4 flights of 4 that you have to manage the air refueling and join up, take off, join up, air refueling, and then navigating to the target. As far as the air-to-air threat is concerned, the MiG pilots, and we didn't think that they were 20 feet tall or anything like that, the pilots. But what we did know was that the airplanes they were flying, like the MiG-21 and the MiG-19, MiG-17, were better dogfighting airplanes than the F-105 or the F-4. They could turn a tighter circle. And so you had to respect that. But we never felt like that their training was superior to ours. And really that's what made us victorious, I think, is the fact that in spite of the shortcomings of, relatively speaking, of our airplanes to theirs, as long as you knew how to fly your airplane and you did it correctly, you were going to have the advantage. I remember 2 or 3 missions that were particularly difficult, and a lot of them were. But so let me go back a little bit to your previous comment. In terms of respect for the enemy, we had a great deal of respect for their air defense system because of the intense array of anti-aircraft guns, most of them radar guided, the surface-to-air missiles, those things. That's really what we realized that was the true threat, not necessarily the MiGs. The ground-to-air capabilities they had, was so concentrated that it was a very difficult proposition to get through that and get to your target and come back. But I remember on several different bombing missions up into the heart of North Vietnam, to a steel mill, for an example, or a rail yard to the north of Hanoi. First of all, you're really a long way from home. And anybody that from there, if you took a hit and had to bail out, then there wasn't much chance of a rescue. But I can remember on several different occasions rolling in, identifying the target, rolling into your 45 or better degree dive bomb pass, and then have tracers so thick that they're going by your windscreen and you just don't know how in the world is it possible for me to fly through that. I mean, you just don't, there's no way I can fly through that, but you are. And, but there's a determination there. You made that commitment long ago. You're a military aviator, you're doing your duty, and so now it's the time to do your duty the very best you can. And once you've gone that far, you want to be sure that you're effective with delivering your bombs. And so you do the best you can to put all of the flak and the smoke that you see everywhere and these tracers going by your canopy and windscreen. You just do your best to put that out of your mind. You concentrate on your target and do your very best to deliver your bombs as accurately as possible. And then the next thing that's on your mind is getting out of there and back home safely. And in the F-105, speed was our friend. There was no airplane in the world that could keep up with the F-105 once the bombs were gone and we had enough fuel and you went to afterburner. Speed was our friend, and we would get out of there in the quickest way we could. They had a very, very robust air defense system when the war started in 1965, basically, when we started flying missions up there. And it only got better during the 1968 bombing halt until 1972 when the Linebacker campaign started. So yes, I think that's accurate. I think the thing that frustrated me most, though, about the situation then was the fact that you could see these great targets of opportunity, such as Haiphong Harbor, such as the military airfields with MiGs lined up down on the ramp. And we were prohibited from attacking those. And it just made no sense to us whatsoever. And especially Haiphong Harbor, when it's a very high percentage of all their military supplies came through there. You know, I can remember a few that were dead set about not being captured if they survived the bailout. They were determined, at least that's what they said, that they wouldn't be captured. I mean, they would go down fighting, basically. And I didn't feel that way. I mean, my personal attitude was that the code of conduct was good enough for me. I'd do the best I could, if I were a prisoner. And if I couldn't adhere to the code of conduct, then I'd do what I had to do without being a traitor to my country. But I don't think anybody can really declare what they're going to do or not going to do until you've experienced being a prisoner of war. I have several friends that spent a lot of time there, and the torture that they went through is just horrendous. Recently, I had the opportunity to go back to Vietnam and meet and visit a MiG-21 pilot that I shot down during the war. And during that visit, the thing I wanted to do most while I was over there was to visit the Hanoi Hilton because of my friends that were there. And I'm so glad I had that opportunity. It's turned into a museum now, and it's cleaned up, I'm sure, from what it was, but it's still a very, very foreboding, terrible place. And I just have a lot of strong feelings about the difficulties and the pain and suffering that our men went through in that prison. The F-105 in some circles has sort of a bad reputation. Its nickname is Thud, but from someone who really flew the airplane, I loved it. I absolutely loved it. I had total confidence in it, and so I give it credit for allowing me to complete my 100 missions safely. It was a challenge and a handful to fly, but it was a great airplane, and it could do things that no other airplane could do at the time. And so, even though it was designed for another mission, it performed the conventional bombing mission quite well. I came back from one of those missions that you asked me about earlier, the real difficult one over North Vietnam. And I knew I had flown through a lot of flak, but I didn't feel anything with the airplane. But when I got out of my airplane, I looked down, and one of my external tanks had a hole in it, in the leading edge. It was a hole about that big. And so they were going to have to scrap the tank, of course. And my crew chief said, that piece of shrapnel might be in there. I said, well, really? I said, yeah. So he cut it open, and sure enough, there's a piece of really jagged lead that was still inside the empty tank. And so that's kind of a souvenir that I have. Obviously, it was a piece of shrapnel that was spent, and I flew through it, or it would have been a lot more damage. But the 105 could take a good bit of damage, and that's one combat mission I won't forget, just because I have the trophy to prove it. When I completed my tour, I came back and was an instructor in the 105 in Wichita, Kansas. And I left there to volunteer for my second combat tour. So it was 1971, I flew my last F-105 mission as an instructor. I have more flying time in it than any other airplane I've flown, and I have about 2,000 hours in the 105. in 1968 and 69, 70, the Air Force had made a decision that the new pilots coming into the 105 would be coming all out of pilot training, which was a rare thing prior to that. But because of the policy of once you flew one combat mission, you would not be required to go back for a second combat tour involuntarily. So therefore, in order to have enough pilots to man the 105 squadrons in Southeast Asia, they had to start taking more recent graduates from pilot training. And that was an enjoyable time for me and a lot of my squadron mates, because all of us, literally all of us, had finished our 100 missions. We had a lot of time in the airplane, and here come these second lieutenants, and they're just like clay, you know, and you can just mold them into really good fighter pilots. And I think most of us knew what it took to be a good fighter pilot. And so not only did we do our best to train them right in the air and in the airplane, but we had an obligation to train them socially as well. So we trained them how to party in the officers club and do all these things. But I still run into these guys that were my students then, and it's always enjoyable. And they remember you, you know, they remember their instructors, and many of them went on to very successful Air Force careers and completed their combat with great honor. So that was an enjoyable time teaching these young guys how the fighter pilot profession, basically. Well, that was a difficult decision for me, but it was a voluntary thing on my part. To put it in context, in 1971, I was still an instructor, but I'd been there for 3 years, and I knew that I was going to be reassigned somewhere in some other type of airplane, either the F-4 or the F-111. And so the Air Force came out with a policy that if you had already completed a tour successfully, you can volunteer for a second tour and get an F-4 checkout and go back and fly another combat mission in the F-4, and another combat tour in the F-4. And this happened because of the restriction or the policy of not requiring people to go back for a second tour. The result of that was most of the fighter squadrons in Southeast Asia by that time were getting lower and lower and lower on experience level. They didn't have people with a lot of fighter experience commanding the squadrons or being their operations officers or their flight commanders, and they needed to get that experience level back over there. So they made that offer. And so I'm thinking that the war's not over. There was no end in sight. Our prisoners of war are still there. And what can I do? What's the best thing for me to do to try to help that process along and end that conflict and maybe do my part in the best way possible? And so I had this notion of volunteering, getting an F-4 checkout and going back. But it was a difficult decision because of family considerations. My wife, just to this day, could not understand that. And I understand why she couldn't. I mean, I didn't have to do it, but as I look back on it, it was the most important decision I ever made in my Air Force career. My intuition was telling me that this is the right thing, the best thing for you to do. And in my experience, my intuition has rarely been wrong for me. And so I raised my hand and volunteered for a second tour, and shortly thereafter I was checking out the F-4 down at Homestead Air Force Base. And then I found myself in June of 1971 in Thailand again at a different base this time, at Udorn Air Base, and flying the F-4. They had done away with the 100 mission tour, and by then it was a year, no matter what you did, how many missions you flew. Our missions were rather, at the time, were rather benign. They were 2-ship bombing missions under a forward air controller, either in South Vietnam or in Laos somewhere. So as much as a combat mission can be low threat, these were. The bombing halt had to do only with bombing over North Vietnam. The war was big going on in South Vietnam. The war was going on in Laos. And so those are the kinds of missions that were being flown at the time. This is in June of 1971 when I got there. And then as the other mission that we had there was a little bit different from other bases. Our wing had a reconnaissance squadron of F-4s there as well. And we were still at that time, in spite of the bombing halt, the reconnaissance, the RF-4s were flying missions over North Vietnam. And each time they did that, there was a flight of 2 F-4 fighters that would escort them. And so the rules of engagement were such that if you were flying this reconnaissance escort mission and the reconnaissance airplane was fired upon, then we were authorized to expend our ordnance on that target. And so those were some of the best missions we had at the time, and because you really felt like you were doing something worthwhile. And believe me, flying over North Vietnam in those days, it was not uncommon to see just convoys of military vehicles lined up down the roads headed to the south. So those were some good missions. And then we got through 1971, and then in April of 1972, I was awakened early in the morning, and the schedule had already been published for the next day, and it was nothing unusual. But I got a call about 2 o'clock in the morning that said, report to the command post at 5 a.m. and with no other information. So I knew something big was probably up. And when I got down there, I did discover that this was the first big strike that had been planned for targets in and around Hanoi since the bombing halt in 1968. This was the beginning of the Linebacker campaign, essentially. And so from that point forward, the missions got more and more exciting and more dangerous. We lost more airplanes, but we were really accomplishing something that needed to be done, and I think, frankly, we were all glad to see the intensity of the war pick up a little bit. On April 16th, 1972, my mission was to be a part of the Basco Fligh. It was a flight of 4 F-4s, led by my good friend Fred Homestead. And Greg Crane's my wingman is number 4. I'm flying number 3. And so we went out to our airplanes and got in normally. One thing different about this particular mission was that it turned out to be an escort mission. And we were supposed to escort another flight of F-4s coming from another base in Thailand. And they had a bombing mission, but our whole mission was air-to-air. We were to protect this other bombing flight from MiGs, and that was our total mission. One of the difficulties, though, was that so many airplanes had been tasked for this big mission that day that we did not have air-to-air tanker support. And so our airplanes were loaded with 3 external fuel tanks and our air-to-air missiles, which would give us enough range to accomplish what we were tasked to do. So we all took off and headed up to northern Laos, which was the rendezvous point of with the other flight. When the centerline tank went dry, we jettisoned that off the airplane because it had a huge limitation to your performance when you had the centerline fuel tank, 600-gallon fuel tank on the center. But that gave us the range we needed to get up there. And we did a couple of orbits waiting to contact the flight we were supposed to escort on the radio, and they just never showed up. So our flight leader, Fredo, decided at that point that we couldn't wait any longer. If we waited any longer, we wouldn't have enough fuel to escort them anyway. And so he decided to change us over to our secondary mission, which was essentially just hunting for MiGs up in North Vietnam. And so that's what we did. We turned and headed the whole flight right toward Hanoi, made a few turns, and we knew where the MiG airfields were. And so we would point our noses toward those fields and sweep with our radar trying to pick them up. And didn't know if we would or we wouldn't, but sure enough, on one of the headings up to the north and west of Hanoi, we got a radar contact on a bandit. Turned a little bit to track the bandit right on a head-on pass. The rules of engagement in those days were that if you had this special equipment on board the airplane, at the time highly classified, called a combat tree, and what that meant was it gave him the capability to monitor the transponder in the MiG airplane. And what that did for you is to ensure that the radar contact that you had on your scope was in fact an enemy airplane and not a friendly. If you had that kind of information, then you were authorized to fire a radar-guided missile beyond visual range. BVR is what we called it. So before you even saw the bandit, you were authorized by the rules of engagement to fire your radar missile head-on, which is the safest thing to do. But the equipment was new, and we pre-briefed before we ever took off that we were not going to do that. We were going to be sure that any MiG that we engaged with, we were going to have a visual on it first. Because the last thing in the world you want to do is shoot down one of your buddies. And so that was the agreement that we all had in our flight of 4. And so we kept turning a little bit to line the radar contacts up on the nose, and sure enough, 2 silver MiG-21s flew right over us. And it was no doubt what they were then. They were enemy airplanes. We did a hard 180-degree turn to try to chase them down. And I'm flying element lead out here on the left. And the turn toward the MiGs was away from me to the right, which threw me behind in the turn, fortunately. And as Fredo went after the 2 silver MiGs, I'm about halfway through the turn, and up pops a camouflage MiG-21. Their strategy was to bait us with the 2 silver ones and have the camouflage one come up behind us while our attention is devoted to the first set of airplanes, and then shoot us from behind. Trouble was, I saw him soon enough to roll out of the turn and then head for him, and then our dogfight was on at that point. Went through weather, he popped into a cloud. I thought we'd lost him. Came out the other side of a cloud bank, and sure enough, there he was again. We were able to see him. And so after a very intense 4 to 5 minute dogfight, and after firing 5 missiles at him between myself and my wingman, I was finally able to get a radar lock on at minimum range, about 4,000 feet out. Fired a radar-guided Sparrow missile, and it tracked on it, guided via the radar beam. At first, I thought it was going to miss him. We'd had several missiles malfunction in this whole process, and I thought it was going to miss him because it was pulling so much lead out here. He was in a high G, descending right-hand turn. But it was tracking accurately. It impacted the MiG where the right wing joins the fuselage, blew the wing totally off the airplane, and smoke and flames went everywhere. The airplane snap rolled, and first snap roll around, out popped a parachute. And it was the MiG pilot in his parachute. And I had to aggressively maneuver my airplane to the side to keep from flying right through his parachute. Flew by it and saw him with his legs extended like this because we were going so fast. I'm sure we were close to supersonic about that time. And then, now this is kind of humorous, but the first thing, strangely, that went through my mind after I flew by the MiG pilot in his parachute was, I want to be sure I get that kill confirmed. Because I'd read all these stories about World War II and Korea, fighter pilots that didn't get credit for a victory because nobody else saw it, nobody could confirm it. And in the F-4D that I was flying, we didn't have a gun in the airplane, so there was no gun camera. What we did have was a radar camera, which all of that could be part of the confirmation process, but there's nothing like having another set of eyes on it. Well, as it turned out, my thought about that didn't amount to anything because I flew by the MiG pilot, and my backseater, Jeff Feinstein, saw him very clearly as well, and my wingman was right with me the whole way, and they confirmed the kill easy enough. And then the next thought that goes through your mind is, you're way away from home, you have no air refueling support, and we're very low on fuel because we had been in this 4 to 5 minute dogfight. And so getting home safely is foremost in your mind. It was a situation where if we had encountered additional MiGs, we wouldn't have had enough fuel to engage them. I mean, it was a scary kind of a time. And so the whole thought then is to head for home in the most direct way possible, as fast as you can, but yet still conserving fuel so that you have enough to get back. Because I knew I couldn't depend on a tanker before I got there. But it all worked out fine. We didn't have a lot of fuel when we landed, but we made it back. Basco Fligh was very successful that day. It was like a fighter pilot's dream. We had worked hard to be ready for this opportunity, and we were. My flight leader, Fred Homestead, shot down one of the 2 silver ones that went over us to begin with, and I shot down this camouflage MiG. And so when we got back, we did a little celebrating that night in the officers club. It was good. But in case of the MiG pilot, his airplane was under such high G-forces when the wing was blown off that he was just very fortunate he was able to reach the ejection handles in the MiG and initiate ejection. And he's a very strong weightlifting kind of a guy, and I think that was probably the only reason he was able to do it. But in spite of that, his ejection seat in the MiG has a system that's supposed to wrap around your arms to keep your arms from flailing out in a high-speed ejection. That malfunctioned somehow, and both of his forearms were broken severely when he bailed out. And as a result, he couldn't control his parachute. He hit the ground really hard, and that injured his back. And so he was hurt pretty bad, and but he did manage to get back on flying status. He was rescued fairly quickly. This all took place about 30 miles southwest of Hanoi, and so it didn't take long for them to find him and rescue him and get him medical care. But he was in rehab for 6 or 7 or 8 months. He got back on flying status, but the war was essentially over by then. And he found out that even though his arms had healed and he was back on flying status, every time he would fly a training mission and pull Gs, it was very painful for him. So he realized he didn't have a career in the Air Force ahead of him. So he resigned his commission, went back to college, and became an insurance executive with Vietnam Insurance Company. So the first thing that happened was just an amazing circumstance of finding the airplane I was flying that day. In 2004, a group of my friends and I traveled from my home in Kentucky to the Air Force Museum. And the staff there made us aware that there was an airplane on display not far from the museum in a little town on the outskirts of Dayton that had, as they put it, historic significance to Kentucky. And as the conversation continued, what we found out was it was number F4D number 550, the airplane I was flying when I shot the MiG down. And so we found the airplane, and it was in really sad shape. They had neglected it. It was all dirty, bird poop all over it. The tires were flat, weeds were growing up all around it. And the Air Force was looking for another home for it. So to make a long story short, my group of good friends and I, we formed what we call Aviation Heritage Park in Bowling. And the whole idea is for us to use aviation artifacts to tell real stories about real aviators from our community. And we felt like if we could get take possession of Phantom 550 and restore it, it could be the cornerstone of this educational facility. And it seemed like a big long shot, but we thought it's worth a try. Something's got to be done to save the airplane anyway. Well, it all worked out. The Air Force gave us permission. We were able to raise enough money in our community. And in December of 2005, she rolled into Bowling Green, Kentucky on 2 flatbed trailers. Got busy cleaning it up and restoring it back to her combat colors. And today she is still serving her country as the lead exhibit in Aviation Heritage Park. And we became acquainted with a lady by the name of Tu Yin. I never thought that would lead anywhere. But 2 weeks later, I received an email from her that said, "We have found the brave MiG pilot, and we want you to come to Vietnam and meet him on live national television." And that's how I met him. It seemed like a setup to me at first. I was skeptical about whether this could really be real. It sounded too good to be true. But I did a lot of investigation through the American Embassy in Hanoi, through other sources, and another community I wanted to check with for sure was the prisoner of war community. I called up a couple of my friends who were former prisoners of war and asked them what they thought about me accepting this invitation. And everywhere I turned, I got encouragement to accept it. And so I did, and in April of 2008, I was in downtown Ho Chi Minh City and meeting my former adversary, Nguyen Hong My. And so Hong Mi and I have agreed that, our primary purpose for the book, or telling our story when we give presentations, is to try to be an example. And the example would be if 2 old crusty fighter pilots can forgive each other, who at one point in time were trying to kill each other. If we can forgive each other, then maybe others can too.
The F-105B is a high-performance fighter bomber capable of carrying special weapons internally to facilitate delivery at maximum speeds. At maximum gross weight in the clean configuration, takeoff run is about 3,000 feet. From brake release to 40,000 takes 2 minutes 42 seconds. The Pratt & Whitney J75 power plant is rated at 15,000 pounds dry and 23,500 with afterburning. This gives a power-weight ratio at takeoff of 1.4 to 1. In contrast, the F-84F has a ratio of 2.4 to 1. Like other contemporary fighters, the 105 has a high concentration of longitudinal mass in relation to lateral mass. This means that motions due to inertia are more likely to couple with motions due to aerodynamic forces and produce violent gyrations. Whether or not this coupling is serious depends upon basic airplane configuration and stability characteristics. Directional stability was built into the 105 by using a ventral fin for effectiveness at high angles of attack and providing enough vertical area to compensate for conditions at high Mach numbers. Longitudinal stability and freedom from pitch-up are provided by the low stabilator position. The relatively high wing places the wake center lines progressively further from the stabilator as angle of attack increases. During flight test, an angle of 20 degrees has been reached. These stability characteristics, together with power loading, make it possible at low supersonic speeds for the airplane to hold or tighten a turn without losing speed. An actual history of a wind-up turn shows G's increasing to 5, while angle of attack increased to 10 degrees at a constant Mach number of 1.45. The flight test program has thoroughly investigated airplane stability and indicates that enough has been built in to provide a good weapons platform which is free from pitch-up and inertia coupling. The level flight speed envelope has been extended beyond predicted values at some points. Maximum Q reached in the extension test to design dive speed is 800 knots indicated at 6,000 feet. The high speed and kinetic energy involved create a deceleration problem. This has been minimized by extremely effective speed brakes, which make possible steep subsonic dives in addition to reducing the time required to slow down for safe emergency ejection. The rugged structure required for high-Q fighter-bomber performance also provides pilot protection during this deceleration period without reliance upon complicated ejection devices. Assuming 550 knots indicated to be safe pilot exposure speed, it takes 10 seconds to decelerate from Mach 2 level flight. Longest times are from design dive speed, with 17 seconds required to slow down from 1.9 to 550. The same high kinetic energy, however, has taken the airplane to 63,000 feet, still going Mach 1.3 after a zoom climb with burner cut at 60. Calculations made using afterburner all the way indicate a 70,000-foot potential. This indicates that energy will be available at 62 or 3 for a firing pass at a supersonic bomber. Slow speed handling characteristics are also good, and the airplane has been landed with a 2,300-foot ground roll. For supersonic air induction, the design must consider the reversal of flow behavior. At subsonic speeds, compression causes higher velocities, but in supersonic flow, compression reduces velocity. Supersonic flow also changes velocity through shock waves, either oblique and weak, or of most concern, strong normal shocks perpendicular to flow, which are characterized by subsonic speed downstream and a large pressure loss, the magnitude of which depends upon the upstream speed at which the shock occurs. If we did not prevent this normal shock from occurring at airplane velocity, a Mach 2 design would probably not reach that speed, since only 72% pressure could be recovered downstream. If we first slow upstream speed to about 1.4, however, 96% recovery is possible. The F-105 uses a novel swept-forward intake to compress the air and slow down velocity before allowing the normal shock to occur. In the more conventional cheek duct arrangement, the air is first compressed outboard and then turned back to the engine, thus losing some efficiency. The 105 intake compresses air inboard only. This allows a thin root section, giving less drag and reducing vortex effect on the stabilator. A sliding plug positioned automatically according to Mach number provides the correct rate of air deceleration. Fuselage bleed doors, positioned by Mach number, air temperature, and angle of attack, provide the means of spilling excess air to match engine requirement with inlet area, thereby controlling shock wave position. This prevents excess air from shocking over the wing, creating drag. In effect, inlet air is compressed and slowed down before the normal shock is allowed to occur, and the shock wave is positioned by controlling expansion on the subsonic side. Another air inlet in the 105 is in the vertical fin. This inlet directs cooling air into the aft section. When this air reaches the ejection nozzle, it is at comparatively low velocity and high pressure. Therefore, it acts as the divergent section of a convergent-divergent nozzle. This reduces fishtail effect and base drag. The fire control system for the 105 has been flying in a modified RF-84F for about 2 years in accordance with the weapon system development concept. It furnishes the capability for both gunnery and rocketry, either air-to-air or air-to-ground, plus dive, level, and labs bombing modes. The versatility of the system produced an average CEP of 1,000 feet in the high toss IP mode and 280 feet in the radar ranging low toss. A central air data computer feeds the fire control system. It also actuates flight control, making the 105 an integrated weapon system capable of automatic flight to the target, semi-automatic ordnance delivery, with a future capability of fully automatic store delivery. The first store drop program was conducted by Special Weapons Center personnel. Repeated, predictable, and accurate drops were made. In addition to labs deliveries, level ejections were made at speeds from 0.9 to 1.73. Faster capabilities will be explored at Eglin, where the program is now underway. During ground tests of the T-171 gun, long bursts at the 6,000 round per minute design rate produced dangerous gun gas concentrations which limited air firing to short bursts. A redesigned purging system is being tested at Eglin. The weapon system would not be complete without due regard for maintainability. Many features have been built into the airplane to aid in this work. Wherever possible, similar equipment has been grouped in bays with large access doors. Mach 2 equipment, however, requires extensive specialized training. Toward this end, over 227 military personnel have already been trained in the various phases of maintenance. To help them in their job, special tools and ground handling equipment are concurrently available. The flight test program, in which many Air Force pilots have been involved, has not disclosed any basic configuration deficiencies. Several mechanical problems have been corrected during flight test, and other hardware changes are being phased into the test inventory. Tactical Air Command is now scheduled for 3 aircraft in October 1958. The 105A was first flown in October 1955 and has accumulated well over 100 flights. It is presently being used to evaluate systems operations such as the emergency hydraulic powered by a ram air turbine, which furnish satisfactory control power at landing and at supersonic speeds with engine cut. It has also successfully completed a drop program conducted by Special Weapons Center personnel. Both bluff and turnaround shapes have been dropped at speeds ranging from Mach 0.9 to 1.3 and altitudes from 8,000 to 35,000 feet. The ejection mechanism is pneumatic with an initial force of 8,000 pounds. A lab's release was also accomplished at Mach 0.92 and 4 Gs. Results of the program prove that repeated, predictable, and accurate ejections can be made at supersonic speeds. The B airplane will be used to further extend the speed regime. Pitch-up has been investigated by both company and Air Force pilots, and apparently the low stabilator has eliminated the problem. The B airplane was forced to make a belly landing on its first flight, due primarily to a nose gear retraction speed far faster than any experienced during hundreds of ground retraction tests. This excessive speed made the uplock system malfunction, and the nose gear could not be extended. By December 1st, however, many modifications resulting from the A program were incorporated, and a total of 22 flights were accomplished. Emphasis has been placed upon evaluation of flying characteristics such as stability and control, thermodynamic measurements to finalize the variable air inlet scheduling, and a gradual extension of top speed. Ultimate objective, of course, is to demonstrate ability to perform the tactical mission for which the weapon system was designed. This mission profile permits delivery of a special store 900 nautical miles from base and return with adequate fuel reserve. Utilizing a 105 buddy tanker operating from the same base, only one in-air refueling will extend this radius almost 50%. This buddy system is based upon a standard 450-gallon external tank modified to carry a drogue and necessary actuating gear along with 230 gallons of fuel. This is carried on the centerline pylon, and the standard Bombay ferry tank is also used. All fuel can be transferred except that necessary for tanker to return to base. Optimum hookup is expected to be at 300 knots indicated at 32,000 feet. This extension puts effective radius well over 1,300 nautical miles. In-air refueling, together with the dispersion possibilities offered by the Zell system, make possible some interesting operations analyses. The fire control system for the 105 has been flying for about 1.5 years in a modified RF-84F. Bombing modes were essentially completed by December 1st, and a production unit will be installed in the second B, expected to fly in January. Further development of the system is expected to provide automatic labs capability. Data reduction so far gives every indication of a successful and timely production installation. 50% of all drops made at Eglin were within 500 feet CEP, and 75% were within 700 feet. Capability is provided for both gunnery and rocketry, air-to-air and air-to-ground, plus dive, level, and labs bombing. The ASW-10 automatic flight control system has also been under development at GE since 1954. Basic requirements were revised 4 times by a Republic GE WADC design team, and the present system has now been approved for production installation. An F-84F was used for stringent component testing. Flight tests in the 105 will start in the spring of 1957 when an air data computer becomes available. Both the A and the B airplanes were flown by Air Force pilots at very early stages and throughout the flight test program. The number of flights per month and total Air Force flights indicate good progress. After Phase 2 tests on the A, Air Force pilots made 29 recommendations. 17 of these have already been incorporated in test airplanes, 7 will be in early production airplanes, and the remaining 5 are in areas where solution will be made prior to delivery to tactical units. In the clean configuration, the B takes off in less than 3,000 feet, and best performance climb speed is about 1.2. True top speed has been extended over Mach 2, and the variable air inlet pressure measurements now being obtained will permit optimum positioning of inlet plugs and bleed doors to attain best pressure recovery for fast acceleration and more speed. At the present, all indications point toward a successful program. Capable of releasing the special store at an indicated airspeed of 750 knots, the F-105B weapon system is now being evaluated by the Tactical Air Command. During the past 18 months, over 600 flying hours have been accumulated on test inventory aircraft at Republic and ARDC flight test centers. Functional tests have been accomplished with basic airframe systems such as speed brakes, refueling probe, and the ram air-driven emergency hydraulic pump. Engine air starts have been made at 25,000 feet and afterburner relights as high as 50,000 feet. In-flight refueling capability has been demonstrated with KB-50 tankers flying at indicated airspeeds of approximately 220 knots at altitudes of 20,000 feet. With the Republic-designed buddy system, refueling can be accomplished at Mach 0.9 at 35,000 feet. The unsatisfactory lateral control feel of the early airplanes has been corrected by the installation of a redesigned control system which has a much greater mechanical stiffness. The level flight velocities attained to date have approached or exceeded the supersonic speeds for which the F-105B was designed. A speed of Mach 1.22 has been reached at 4,400 feet, Mach 1.56 at 19,500 feet, Mach 2.01 at 35,000 feet, and Mach 2.01 at 40,000 feet. The maximum indicated airspeed attained thus far has been 800 knots at an altitude of 6,500 feet. This speed was reached in a shallow dive and corresponds to a dynamic pressure, or Q, of 2,200 pounds per square foot. The design Q for the 105 is 2,500 pounds per square foot. For minimum landing distance and maximum tire and brake life, the 105B is provided with a 20-foot drag chute. For additional improvement, an anti-skid brake system is being developed. Functional reliability has been established for the chute, but difficulty is being experienced with the anti-skid system at speeds below 50 knots. The Goodyear system originally tested is being modified to incorporate a brake pressure modulator, which will provide gradual brake reapplication during anti-skid cycles, thereby obtaining effective braking and alleviating pitching and excessive gear walking. The static test model is currently undergoing structural evaluation at the Wright Air Development Center. Thus far, the wing and fuselage have been successfully tested to limit load for the most critical flight condition, which is 7.3 Gs at Mach 1.2 at 24,000 feet. The stabilator structure, control system, and landing gear struts have been successfully tested to ultimate load. Ultimate load is 50% greater than limit load and is that load at which failure can occur. Structural integrity flight demonstrations are scheduled to begin during the latter half of 1958. The 8th F-105 will be used for this program. Instrumentation to record structural loads and air pressure distribution at selected stations is currently being installed. The 9th F-105 was assigned to the Extreme Temperature Evaluation Program. Instrumentation to record over 300 parameters was incorporated into this airplane during production, the recording components being installed in a bomb bay pod. While instrumentation was being installed, low-temperature functional tests of hydraulic actuators revealed a leakage problem at temperatures below -40 degrees Fahrenheit. To avert leakage during the test program, a newly developed seal was retrofitted throughout the hydraulic system. On October 7, 1957, the airplane was placed into the Climatic Projects Laboratory at Eglin Air Force Base. Functional checks were conducted at temperatures down to -65 degrees Fahrenheit. Since only a few minor problems developed during the entire 6-week test period, the airplane was considered well qualified for the Arctic operation phase of the low-temperature evaluation program. On February 1, 1958, the airplane departed for Eielson Air Force Base, Alaska. At Eielson, aircraft maintenance was performed on the flight line. A total of 9 flight hours were accumulated during the 10 missions flown, one turnaround being accomplished within 12 minutes. Differential braking, in conjunction with nose wheel steering, provided adequate maneuverability for taxiing and parking on snow-covered surfaces. The average takeoff run in the clean configuration on hard-packed snow-covered runways was 2,600 feet. As the lowest surface temperature encountered was only -10 degrees Fahrenheit, present plans are to conduct additional tests during the 1958-59 test season. To provide the highest possible speeds for delivery of the special store, along with an element of mission security, the F-105 fighter bomber was designed to carry the store internally. The bomb bay doors retract inwardly to provide minimum drag and buffeting at supersonic store delivery speeds. Internal store releases are accomplished by means of a unique ejection mechanism which utilizes a pneumatic cylinder to provide a 19,000-pound ejection force. This ejection mechanism is also used as a bomb hoist, thereby facilitating store installation. 9 special store releases have been accomplished to date from the F-105B. These releases were at various points within the flight envelope and exhibited excellent separation characteristics. Representative speeds were Mach 1.73 at 40,000 feet, Mach 1.59 at 27,500 feet, and Mach 1.22 at 4,400 feet, the Q at this point being 1,900 pounds per square foot. One of the releases was an over-the-shoulder toss, with entry at an altitude of 500 feet at Mach 0.87 and roll out after a 4G pull-up at an altitude of 19,000 feet at Mach 0.55. Pilots report that above 400 knots indicated, a mild buffet exists with open bomb bay doors. The buffet is not objectionable, nor does it change with increase in airspeed to 750 knots indicated. There is no trim change at store ejection, but a slight jolt can be felt. For defense against enemy aircraft, as well as strafing of ground targets such as missile sites, the F-105B incorporates the M61 Vulcan gun, which is capable of firing 20mm ammunition at the rate of 6,000 rounds per minute. Early design information indicated that with a proposed gun installation, excessive gun gas concentrations would not develop in the gun area. Initial firing tests, however, revealed an excessive gas accumulation throughout the nose compartment. After considering various methods of eliminating this gas, an air ejector type purging system was designed. This system consists of a gun barrel shroud, an air ejector pump, a 1 1/2 inch purge line from the gun barrel shroud, and a 3-inch purge line from the vicinity of the gun breech. The air ejector pump, a simple device without any moving parts, is capable of evacuating any gaseous mixture from the nose compartment at the rate of 30 pounds per minute. It consists of a mixing chamber and a converging-diverging nozzle. It functions by utilizing high-pressure air from the engine to entrain the air in the mixing chamber, thereby creating a secondary flow through the purge lines and exhausting overboard any gun gas and air mixture that may be present in the nose compartment. Gun firing tests at Edwards Air Force Base revealed that after a 200-round burst at a gun rate of 5,600 rounds per minute, over 15 seconds of purging time was required to clear the nose compartment of gun gas contamination. Additional research disclosed that blast tube choking was occurring and gun gases were being forced down open barrels of the gun and into the nose compartment. Tests with a modified blast tube indicated a lower gas accumulation, and a complete redesign was undertaken to reduce blast pressure at the gun muzzles to a minimum. Gun firing tests with a redesigned blast tube showed a considerably smaller quantity of gas in the nose compartment after a 200-round burst and complete purging within 2 seconds. To further reduce the quantity of gas entering the nose compartment, a ring seal was installed at the aft end of the blast tube to improve sealing with a muzzle stabilizer. Satisfactory performance of the present installation has been demonstrated at subsonic speeds and altitudes up to 20,000 feet. These tests were conducted with 350-round bursts at gun rates in excess of 5,600 rounds per minute. Firing tests at supersonic speeds and altitudes up to 45,000 feet are currently being conducted at Eglin and thus far indicate satisfactory performance. Functional tests of the canopy jettison and seat ejection systems were performed at Republic prior to first flight of the 105. Further evaluation of the escape system was conducted under surveillance of Coleman Engineering at the ARDC Supersonic Sled Facility located at Hurricane Mesa, Utah. The first test was conducted at 160 knots. Failure of a seat catapult test fitting, however, reduced the ejection force, resulting in a tail clearance of only 3 feet. The second test at 160 knots demonstrated excellent escape system performance, a tail clearance of 50 feet being obtained. Satisfactory escape system performance was also demonstrated at 540 knots. However, the right armrest failed shortly after ejection. The seat trajectory at this speed indicated a tail clearance of approximately 7 feet. The peak transverse deceleration of the dummy and seat was 54 Gs. The final test was conducted at a speed of 750 knots, or Mach 1.2. The results indicated that survival would be unlikely. Now in production, these F-105B supersonic fighter bombers will soon be delivered to operational squadrons of the Tactical Air Command. During December 1957, a mock-up of the F-105D was inspected by a group of Air Force representatives. While retaining the combat capability of the B, the D will incorporate search and ranging radar as well as integrated flight instruments to provide the pilot with a blind air-to-air and air-to-ground attack capability. The radar will also indicate terrain clearance, and with radar map corrections will permit Doppler navigation to the target area with minimum error. To accommodate the new radar equipment, the nose was lengthened 15 inches and a linkless ammunition feeder installed. The flight plan for a tactical bombing mission against a target 707 nautical miles distance would be take off and climb to 30,000 feet at Mach 0.83, drop the fuselage tank when empty, and cruise at Mach 0.82 for 1 hour, 18 minutes. Climb to 37,500 at 0.87, drop wing tanks and pylons when empty, and accelerate to 1.38. Deliver the store and escape with a sea level run at 0.99 for 2 minutes. Climb to 35,000 at 0.91 and cruise for 27 minutes at 0.86. Climb to 40,000 at 0.91 and cruise to base at 0.87. The F-105E, a two-place version of the D, will have the same combat capabilities at a small reduction in speed and range. The prototype models of both D and E are currently being assembled. First flight for the D airplane is scheduled for July 1959, with the E following later that year. In a brief ceremony on May 27, 1958, Mundy Peel, President of Republic, presented the 12th F-105 produced to General Weiland, Commander of the Tactical Air Command.
Mr. Peel, men and women of Republic Aviation, distinguished guests, it gives me a tremendous amount of satisfaction to accept this first production unit of the F-105 Thunderchief on behalf of the United States Air Force and of the Tactical Air Command.
Shortly after the ceremony, Lieutenant Colonel Scott, commander of the 335th Tactical Fighter Squadron, departed for Eglin Air Force Base, where TAC pilots will conduct the operational suitability phase of the F-105 Weapon System Evaluation Program.
April the 16th, 1972, these two men met in the field of combat. And we're going to hear that story firsthand this morning. All the way from Bowling Green, Kentucky, Brigadier General Dan Cherry sits next to me. He served in the U.S. Air Force for 29 years. He commanded the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing and also the U.S. Air Force Thunderbirds. He flew 295 combat missions in Vietnam. General Dan Cherry. And the gentleman in the red shirt here is all the way from Vietnam. He is Hong Mi. He spent 4 years in the Soviet Union learning how to fly airplanes and checking out on the MiG-21. He was presented his North Vietnamese pilot's wings by Ho Chi Minh himself. And he shot down an American F-4 just days before he got shot down, all the way from Vietnam. Please welcome Hong Mi. Sitting next to Hong Mi is Dr. Tang Huang. She is professor of Defense Language Institute in Monterey, California. Welcome. The first question goes to Hong Mi. He's never been here in Oshkosh, and as a pilot, I want your what's your opinion about it?
First time I go to Oxford. I cannot speak English. My translator helped me. Thank you. Tôi đã dự nhiều air show của hàng không và 2009 thì tôi dự cái air show ở tháng 3 cũng tương đối lớn, nhưng tôi nghĩ rằng cái air show lần này ở Ascot có lẽ là air show lớn nhất của Mỹ mà tôi được dự.
Hello everybody, it's my pleasure to be here today. I have attended a couple of air shows in the United States, but here this is the first time at Oshkosh, and I think Oshkosh is the biggest event.
Thank you for that. Dan, and by the way, I have permission to call him Dan. I don't go around calling general officer by their first name without petition, but he gave me that honor this morning. Dan, let's talk about your training in the Air Force.
Well, yes, Dan, please do. And call me Dan. And all of you, too. I hope you do. The Air Force is very good to me. I think back on my 29 years with tremendously fond memories, great gratitude for the Air Force helping me to grow up as a young man and giving me tremendous opportunities to fly the very best fighter planes our Air Force had during that day and to work with some of the very best people. It was just a wonderful experience. Not without its sacrifices, not without its challenges. In my 29 years in the Air Force, my wife and I sat on the front steps of our last Air Force house and started counting up the number of times we had moved in our time in the Air Force. And it turned out to be in 29 years we had moved 22 times. But it was a good life. And again, like I say, I feel very honored to have had it. I first entered the Air Force in the aviation as an aviation cadet and started out as a navigator, and then shortly after that got selected for pilot training. Went to pilot training in Selma, Alabama at Brigadier Air Force Base, and graduated fortunately first in my class in pilot training, and went from there to check out in the F-105 Thunderchief. That was the airplane of my choice at the time. Went to Europe for a short assignment in the F-105, and then from there to combat in 1967. So I really had a wonderful Air Force career, again, flying the airplanes like the F-105, the F-4 Phantom that you see behind us here, and also the F-16. So again, I'm a lucky guy, no question about it. Very, very fortunate. And lucky to be here today, too.
All of us are. Hongmei, would you describe your training in Russia and your checkout in the MiG-21?
Năm 1965, khi tôi đang học đại học kinh tế thì không quân về khám tuyển. Và tôi là một trong 2 người được trúng tuyển từ 1.700 sinh viên.
In 1965, I was a freshman at the Economics University when the Air Force came to recruit pilots, and I was among 2 candidates selected among the 1,700 candidates.
Để chuẩn bị cho chiến tranh thì chúng tôi phải đào tạo gấp. Trong lúc chương trình đáng lẽ ra là mùa đông phải nghỉ thì chúng tôi đã phải gạt tuyết đi để cho máy bay hạ cánh, và gần như là chúng tôi thời gian huấn luyện là 1 gấp đôi.
Since we have urgent training, we received the flying training in the Soviet Union, and we practice flying even in winter when we have to shovel the snow in order to fly.
Trong số chúng tôi đi học ở Liên Xô cũ hồi đó là 120 người. Và sau một thời gian huấn luyện, sau gần 4 năm huấn luyện thì được 19 người tốt nghiệp MiG-21 và 30 người tốt nghiệp MiG-17. Và đến đầu năm 1968 thì tôi quay về Việt Nam để tham gia đánh nhau với đen.
Among the 120 candidates who were sent to the Soviet Union to study flying, only 19 graduated from MiG-21 training and 30 graduated from MiG-17 training. In 1968, I graduated, returning to my home country, prepared to meet with them.
That's great. Let's talk about the airplane, Dan. Compare the MiG-21 to the F-4. Advantages, disadvantages for both.
Well, they were quite different airplanes, and we were just thrilled that EAA and the Warbirds in Review were able to pull together 2 airplanes, the F-MiG and also the F-4. We've never had the opportunity to have both of our airplanes in the same place at the same time, but it is a remarkable comparison. The F-4 much larger, as you can see, easier to see in a combat environment. Not as maneuverable, really, in a turning dogfight as the MiG-21, but the F-4 had better armament. We had, in the model I was flying, the F-4D, we did not have a gun, but we had radar-guided missiles, the AIM-7 Sparrow, and we also had the AIM-9 Sidewinder as our primary armament. The MiG-21, small airplane, very difficult to see, very fast, good turning airplane. One of the disadvantages was that it had very short legs. Couldn't stay airborne very long, especially if he's in afterburn. But it did carry heat-seeking ATOL guided missiles, and some of the models also had a 30mm cannon. So again, a very formidable opponent. We treated the MiG-21 with tremendous respect, and I remember in the back of my mind, I always told myself that if I had a chance to become engaged in an intense dogfight with a MiG-21, I was going to do it on my terms. I was going to be sure I always had the advantage. If I ever felt myself starting to lose the advantage in just a little bit, it was time to turn and basically run and come back and fight another day more on your terms. Because again, very lethal, very formidable opponent for the F-4.
In my hand, I have this wonderful little book called My Enemy, My Friend, which is available over in the Warburg merchandise area after this presentation. You can read it in a couple of hours, but it is the most moving book I've ever read. And you need to pick it up for your library after this presentation. But now we're going to get into the mission. Dan, take it from here.
Well, on April 16th, 1972, I was a member of a flight of 4 F-4s. Call sign was Basco Fligh. And for those of you who have watched the History Channel program Dogfights, you might have picked up the episode called Hell Over Hanoi when they feature our dogfight on the program. I was very flattered by that because all of you who are enthusiasts of aviation or aviators yourselves realize how difficult it is to explain the dynamics of a dogfight to anybody. I see Colonel Bud Anderson out here in the audience, and he'll probably back me up on this. It's just hard to tell people. Yes, please. Please. It's very difficult to tell someone about what happened when you were in a dogfight. There's too much going on, very dynamic environment, but the History Channel does it very, very well. We're using digital animation, interviews with the actual people involved, and then excellent narration to put the whole thing in context. But in a nutshell, on April 16, 1972, as I mentioned earlier, I was a member of Basco Fligh, a flight of 4 F-4s. Our primary mission that day was to escort other F-4s that were coming from a different base in Thailand on a bombing mission. And our primary chore that day was to be sure that the enemy fighters were not able to attack them as they're on their way to the target. The flight that we were supposed to escort had some sort of maintenance difficulty and didn't show up in time. And so my flight leader, Fred Homestead, made a very courageous decision that we would immediately revert to our secondary mission, and that was basically trolling for MiGs up around Hanoi and searching with our radars all the known MiG bases just to see if we could pick something up. We had to make a decision quickly on that just because of our fuel state. We were starting to run low on fuel. We did not have tanker support that day dedicated to us, and so we had to be extra sensitive about it. But in any case, Fredo turned Basco Flight, headed right for Hanoi. We made a couple of turns, and then suddenly on the radar, Fredo's backseater called out. His name is Stu Moss, and matter of fact, I saw him here at AirVenture just last year. But Stu said, I've got 2 blue bandits on the nose for 20. And we have all this recorded from a little tape recorder in the cockpit. Still very exciting to me when I listen to it, Dan, but again, that's when the fight really started, and we tracked him all the way down. In Fredo's airplane that morning, we had at that time this very highly classified equipment called a combat tree, and we were able to actually interrogate the MiG's radar, and our rules of engagement had been changed to allow us to fire a radar missile without visual confirmation that it was truly an enemy airplane. We had an internal rule within Basco Flight and within my squadron that we would not do that. The worst thing a fighter pilot can do is to shoot down one of your buddies up there, and nothing is worth that. So we decided that we were, even though we had legally we could have, we were going to visually confirm that anything we engaged was an actual enemy. As it turns out, we did engage 4 MiG-21s, 2 silver ones that came over head on to us, and then 2 trailers behind that, one of those being on me. As the two silver MiGs came over our head, we made a hard turn to position into their 6 o'clock. And as we did that, I was flying on the outside of the turn, and it made me fall behind in the turn, fortunately. It was at that point that Hong Mi came up from a low altitude, and it's hard for a fighter pilot to talk with one hand, you know that. I think I'm okay. But as we made the turn, Hong Mi came up a little prematurely. Second element, I saw them turn toward him. He saw us, and then broke away and went into a cloud bank. And at that point, I thought we'd lost him for sure. I never thought we'd see him again. Still trying to search for him and get a lock on with our radar. My backseater's name was Jeff Feinstein. Jeff went on to become an ace, a backseat ace during the war, but this was his first victory. But we chased, at least where we thought that he had gone, into the cloud for a period until I couldn't stand it any longer. In North Vietnam, you did not want to be in a cloud because you couldn't see the missiles coming, the ground-to-air missiles. That was the only way you could defeat a SAM missile fired at you, was to be able to see it quickly and then turn to defeat it, its turn radius. So being in a cloud is like a death trap. You don't want to do that. But pretty aggressive in trying to wait a bit in the cloud anyway to see if we could pick up a radar contact on the MiG. Decided it was not going to work, and so pulled out on top and started to turn back to join my leader again and offer mutual support when we spotted Hong Mi about 2 o'clock high, about 3,000 or 4,000 feet above us. Went into diverter, did a hard turn to try to position, fired 2 AIM-9 heat-seeking missiles, both of them failed. Changed leads with my wingman, Greg Crane, who fired 3 AIM-7 missiles. All 3 failed to track properly. I took the lead back, was closing on the MiG at this point, feeling very confident in terms of position, and was able to track him very easily, and my gun sight told Jeff to lock it up, and right about that time the gun sight indicated a radar lock on. And what had happened is one of the missiles from my wingman that were fired at Hong Mi had caused him to break real hard into the missile, which dissipated almost all of his energy. And that's what made him vulnerable really to my attack. But anyway, I thought there was something wrong with my airplane because of my AIM-9 failure to fire successfully the AIM-9 heat seekers. So as I clamped down on the trigger for the radar missile shot, I was very surprised when the AIM-7 came out, did a little barrel roll, the rocket ignited, and it was headed way out in front of the MiG. And I thought, well, there's another one that's malfunctioned. But in reality, all it was doing was pulling lead on the MiG. And at about 4,000 feet, which is minimum range for the AIM-7 Sparrow, my missile impacted Hong Mi's right wing root, blew the wing completely off the airplane. The airplane went into a very quick snap roll, and about the first time around, out popped his parachute. I had to aggressively maneuver my F-4 to the side to keep from flying right through his parachute, because what I remember most is that chute being in my face. So I moved the airplane over quickly, rolled it up, and Bud, you'll get a kick out of this. People ask me, what's going through your mind about then? And I'd heard so many stories about the greatest generation and all their victories and things, and many of our fighter pilots losing credit for a victory because nobody could confirm it. And I'm worried that nobody's going to confirm that. Anyway, first of all, I was determined for my backseater, Jeff, to see it. And of course, my wingman's right there with me. He saw everything. There wasn't any doubt, but it's funny how in a strange situation like that, things go through your mind. But that's really what I thought. But we flew by Hong Mi in his parachute. He was horizontally, not dangling like you might think someone, because we were going so fast, probably 550 or so, something like that. Went by him very close, within a couple of 100 feet. And then the next thought in your mind is getting home safely. Very low on fuel. We knew we didn't have dedicated tanker support, and we were a long way from home. So, and we still had a lot of enemy territory to fly over. The fact of the matter is, if we had been engaged by additional MiGs at that point, we would not have had enough fuel to safely engage again to protect ourselves. So it was kind of tense right then, being sure that we stayed together as a flight, and we got down somewhat low altitude and went as fast as we could, trying to conserve fuel to make it back to Udorn. Now, while all this is going on, my flight leader, Fred Homestead, shot down one of the 2 silver ones that came out initially. So it was a great day for Basco Fligh. We all got home safe and sound. We celebrated a little bit in the officers club that night. I wondered for a while what really happened to the MiG pilot, because I saw him so clearly in his parachute. But when you're in an environment like that, you don't dwell on things from one day to the next, because the very next day I was up flying another combat mission. You're more concerned about the present and the future than what happened yesterday. But we did celebrate. I wondered if, about the MiG pilot for an hour or two there, if he really lived. Did he have a family? All those personal questions. But then for 36 years, it was way on the back burner of my mind. So again, an exciting day for Basco Fligh. Not so exciting for Hong Mi. Would you like for me to describe his situation at that point, Dan?
Sure.
I can ask Hong Mi to do this as well. The MiG-21's ejection seat that has a mechanism that wraps around your arms to protect your arms from frailing in the slipstream when you come out of the cockpit. That part of the system failed, and as a result, Hong Mi's arms went out into the slipstream. Let me ask him to explain a little bit about his injuries and his parachute landing fall and what happened to him in the jungle.
Sau khi tôi đã tránh được khoảng 5 quả tên lửa, thì đến quả tên lửa thứ 6, bởi vì ở vị trí 6 giờ cho nên tôi không có cách nào tôi phát hiện ra và tôi đã trúng. Thế và khi tôi biết là máy bay của tôi trúng tên lửa thì tôi nhảy dù.
I must say that when you stay at your enemy 6 o'clock, what you could do was to shoot him down first. But if you stay at his 12 o'clock, you could do nothing but trying to escape from him. I was in that situation that day. I never had a chance to launch any missile. After being able to avoid 4 or 5 missiles, I could not see the last one, and I got hit by them cherry. Then I felt my aircraft take a violent hit, and I ejected.
Khi tôi nhảy dù ra thì cái hệ thống bảo vệ tay của cái dù không làm việc, và tại thời điểm bắn ra khỏi máy bay thì tôi bị gãy cả hai tay từ trên trời luôn.
As soon as I ejected from the aircraft, there was a malfunction of the system, so the effect of the wind blast broke my both arms immediately.
Khi nhảy dù thì vì hai tay gãy cho nên tay tôi không điều khiển được dù. Thế và rơi xuống đất thì là tôi chỉ có nằm còng queo ở trong rừng á. Thế và lúc đấy thì tôi không sợ chết, nhưng mà tôi nghĩ là bây giờ nằm giữa rừng này mà hai tay gãy cả hai rồi thì chẳng may có con hổ nó nhảy ra thì tôi không biết là chạy đi đâu.
Even though my mind knew what to do in order to control the parachute, my both arms could not respond at all. As a result, my parachute drifted freely and I came down to the jungles. Later, when recalling the moment when I was laying down in the jungle, I felt my thought process were rather funny, because at that time the most thing I was concerned was that in case a tiger would jump out to kill me, what would I do?
Thank you.
Dan, let's talk about your second meeting with Hong Mi.
Quý vị có biết không, trong lúc đang uống rượu mừng ở cùng với bạn bè thì tôi đang chuẩn bị lên bàn mổ ở bệnh viện.
Did you know that meanwhile Dan Cherry were drinking champagne for his victory, I was about to be on the operation table.
Well, can you see why we're friends? Our second meeting, and actually our first face-to-face meeting, took place in 2008 in Ho Chi Minh City, what used to be known as Saigon. I became involved in the in early 2000s with a project in Bowling Green, Kentucky called Aviation Heritage Park. And what we do, we become an educational facility where we restore aviation artifacts that represent the real stories about real aviators from our part of the country. And on just a happenstance trip to the Air Force Museum, a group of my friends and I were made aware that the airplane I flew on April 16, 1972, F-4D number 550, was on display in a little town on the outskirts of Dayton, and it was in need of a new home. So to make a long story short, one thing led to another. We did establish Aviation Heritage Park in Bowling Green, Kentucky. The Air Force gave us permission to take possession of the airplane and to restore it back to its combat colors. And so in December of 2005, Phantom 550 rolled into Bowling Green, Kentucky on 2 flatbed trailers. Today, you can visit Phantom 550 restored in all of her glory as she continues to serve her country in Aviation Heritage Park to Bowling Green, so I invite you down to do that if you'd like. But anyway, the course of being reunited with my airplane was kind of emotional. I was glad to see it again, but it was in very bad shape in terms of just being neglected. Dirty, very much a victim of bird abuse. Tires were flat, grass was growing up all around her. But it also caused me to remember and to truly think for the first time in 36 years what happened on April 16th. Questions about the fate of the MiG pilot kept coming up in my mind. Who was he? Did he really survive? Did he have a family? All those human questions. And so we decided, my group of friends and I, who were founders of the Heritage Park, decided that we would do some serious outreach to see what we could determine. In the course of doing that, we made contact with a young lady who's a television producer on Vietnam television. Her name is Tu Yen, and she's a nightly news anchor for Vietnam. She also hosts a program called The Separation Never Seems to Have Existed. And it's much like an old program we had here in the United States called This Is Your Life. And they do video profiles on people who have been separated for whatever reason. And then on live national television, they record the reunion so that the live audience can experience the emotion of that. Well, she heard about my search to find out more about the MiG pilot. She thought that might fit her format. And she wrote me an email and asked me to write her a letter, tell her what I wanted to do and why. So I did that. I described the date, the time, and the place of the dogfight. I told her that I'd always been curious about his fate, whether he lived or died, and I wanted to know his name and whether or not he had a family, and I would love to make contact, and I asked her for her help. I never expected anything to happen from that email. But it was only 2 weeks later that I received an email from her. She said, "We have found the brave MiG pilot. We want you to come to Vietnam and meet him on national television." So I was pretty much blown away by that. I thought, first of all, well, it's too good to be true. It's a setup, it's a hoax, there's something wrong with this. But I consulted with a lot of friends and people, the U.S. Embassy included, and everybody encouraged me to accept the invitation. Told me that the television show was definitely legitimate, very popular in Vietnam, and so I in April of 2008, I found myself in Saigon. And that evening, went to the television studio. The anchor of the show, Tu Yen, introduced me, asked me basic questions like why I was in Vietnam, what I hoped to accomplish, things like that. And then very dramatically, she introduced Nguyen Hong Mi. He stepped out from behind a curtain across the studio, across the television set. And my heart is beating 90 miles an hour. I wanted this meeting to go well. I wanted there to be a basis for friendship, and my intuition told me I was doing the right thing, but I really didn't know. He steps out, and as you can see, he's a very handsome man. Very much like a Vietnamese fighter pilot ought to look to me. He's wearing a ball cap now, but he doesn't. His head is totally shaved, but he's dressed in a business suit, and he came walking toward me with a pleasant look. He didn't have a smile, but it was a pleasant look, and I extended my hand. We had a very firm handshake, and Hong Mi said to me, "Welcome to my country. I'm glad to see that you're in good health, and I hope that we can be friends." And so that's how our friendship started, right there on that television show. After the show was over, he invited me to his home. He lives in Hanoi. And so we flew together on Vietnam Airlines from Saigon to Hanoi the next day. And that alone was an extremely emotional, surreal experience. Looking out on that same countryside that I had flown countless combat missions over, it all looked the same. But yet I'm shoulder to shoulder with a MiG-21 pilot. Pretty remarkable. But he invited me to have dinner in his home with his family, and we did that evening. A wonderful Vietnamese dinner prepared. I got to meet his son. I also had the privilege of meeting his, at that time, his only grandchild. Hong Thud was his only grandson at that point in time in 2008. And he was celebrating on that very day his first birthday. And as soon as we approached Hong Mi's front door, his son came out holding Hong Thud. And Granddaddy grabbed him, like grandfathers do. And I went over to see if I could establish some sort of communication with the little boy, and all of a sudden, Hong Mi handed me his grandson. And I was just amazed and emotionally touched by that in such a short period of time, the trust between the two of us had grown to the point where he would trust me to hold his only grandchild. But we had a wonderful time together, and then the following year, Hong Mi, at my invitation, came to our country. He was able to visit me in Kentucky, have dinner in my home, and we had a wonderful time in 2009 visiting the Sun and Fun Fly-In in Lakeland, and then our nation's capital, where we were guest speakers at the Smithsonian Air and Space magazine. So again, the friendship has grown, it's real, and each time we get to see each other, which is no more than once a year, it's great to renew a very solid friendship, and we, as expected, we have far more in common than we ever did differences.
I told you this was a good story. Remember I told you also that Hong Mi shot down an F-4 Phantom? Well, Dan's got a little surprise for us.
Yes, and Hong Mi can tell a little bit of this story too, but before he does, in January of 1972, Hong Mi was victorious over an American RF-4. As a result of that victory, he proudly wears his nation's highest combat award called the Ho Chi Minh War Medal, awarded only to those pilots who scored victories over enemy airplanes. And a part of the book, Miami, My Friend, one of the chapters is entitled The Double Full Circle. As I left Vietnam in 2008, as we were saying goodbye to each other after our very first face-to-face meeting, he asked me to do some research for him. He said, "Remember when I explained my badge and that I had shot down an American airplane?" And I said, "Yes, I do." He said, "You know, I think the American pilot was killed. If he was killed, I would like to extend my condolences to his family. If he is alive, I would like to meet him someday." And so I promised him I would do the research, and so all the way home, my mind is racing with all the things that had happened in those last 2 days. And as soon as I got home, I began the process of trying to determine who it was that Hong Mi shot down in January of 1972. My research was successful, determined that it was a reconnaissance version of the F-4 that he shot down. The pilot's name was Bob Mock. The weapons systems officer name was John Stiles. And please help me in welcoming up here to the stage, Mr. John Stiles. It's really been quite an adventure, and the story seems to have legs and keep growing and everything. But what a wonderful thing to discover who John was in this way, and to be there watching these two men have their first reunion. And then since then, since 2009, watching that friendship grow has been remarkable. Now, John is here with us today, thanks to the efforts of another gentleman. I'd like to ask Bob Noble to come forward. Bob was a helicopter crewman who pulled John Stiles out of the jungle back in January. Bob flew for Air America for a number of years, and so, again, our list of friendships that this story has created continues to grow, but we're delighted with where we are with it. We're going to be giving a presentation at the museum tomorrow afternoon at 2 o'clock, where John will be able to speak and tell the details of his remarkable ejection, evasion, and escape and rescue. It's really an incredible story unto itself. But again, the message that comes out of this story and this book primarily is the message of forgiveness, reconciliation, moving on from the past, and living life in the future and the present, and not dwelling on the unpleasantness of the past. So again, we hope the details of this story are useful to you in your personal lives. Doctor, would you ask Hong Mi for his final thought? Please sum this up, please.
Câu chuyện nhỏ của 4 người chúng tôi thì quý vị đã nghe qua rồi. Nói chung là có rất nhiều điều thú vị và có rất nhiều điều muốn nói. Nhưng mà có lẽ là chương trình sẽ tiếp tục trong ngày mai. Còn hôm nay thì vì điều kiện thời gian có hạn, cho nên là lần nữa xin chúc quý vị vui vẻ, hạnh phúc và dự một cái show tuyệt vời.
I think that there are still many interesting things about the story of 4 of us, but I would like to leave that surprise tomorrow. Please join us.
Dan mentioned my book, Miami, My Friend, that we'll be autographing in the gift shop earlier. And when Hong Mi first came to the United States in 2009, I had just published the book, and I wanted him to have one of the first copies. And so as he arrived, and after that long trip from Vietnam, we went to the hotel, I gave him a copy of the book and told him it was for him, and I hope he enjoyed it, and that sort of thing. I knew at that point that he reads English quite well, so I was hoping he would read it and like the book. Well, the next morning, I met him at the hotel. We had a busy week ahead of us, and the first question I asked him as we were having breakfast was, "How did you like the book?" And he said, "I didn't like it." Well, you can imagine how I felt by that, and I didn't pursue that. I just dropped it, changed the subject, went on to something else, because I wanted our visit here in the United States to go well. I didn't want to start off on a negative note, but so I just dropped the subject. But just before he left, when he was leaving to get on to the airplane to fly back to Vietnam, I had to bring the subject up again. And I said, "Hong Mi, you know, when you first came, you said you didn't like my book." And I said, I wonder why you didn't like it." He said, "Oh no, Dan, I didn't mean that I didn't like your book. I meant that I just don't like the title, because I don't think you and I were ever really enemies. We were just soldiers. We were just soldiers doing the best we could for our country."
I'd like to recognize, I'd like to recognize Connie Boland. She's the founder director of Warwards and Review right there. I'd like to make one last comment I made last year when we talked to Bob Hoover, and this was true. These guys didn't fight for any dictator or any government, any politician. They fought for each other, and they fought for their country, and that's a fact. And I noticed things about all fighter pilots. They have certain things in common. They love their country, they have a great sense of humor, and they're all wonderful gentlemen, just like each of you guys here.